Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to an edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Piñero. Welcome back again to the fifth, or is it sixth, Mathsquad edition of the Community Podcast. Today we have Scardium, as always, and now also we have Arthur Perkins joining us for today's program. We are going to be talking about simple game systems versus complex gaming systems, their strengths, their weaknesses, the assumptions that we make about them, etc. So normally, of course, when we talk about gaming, we talk about Dungeons & Dragons. And Dungeons & Dragons have had a very interesting curve in that it initially started as a rather simple system. At least that was how it was sold back in BASIC. But it quickly got very complicated. And ever since has tried to sort of pare itself down. But even in 5th edition, which is the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons, it's not as simple as it could be. So what are the strengths and weaknesses, say, of a simple system? What would constitute a simple system?
So I think like the quintessential example of simple systems is going to either be something like Microscope, where it's basically just some very vague rules on just how to describe scenes together. And then you can go all the way on to the other side of things, which is more like GURPS and Pathfinder, where they try the route of trying to model and create rules for every single conceivable system. And like it sort of runs the gamut for every other system between those two. But
well, I would contest. I'm not totally sold on Pathfinder there. Pathfinder at its most basic level is actually kind of simple. It's just that every additional book that's added to it has added rules and new subsystems, and it just went from, like a roll for grappling is now 15 different things that were added into the books.
And that's a very interesting thing, yeah.
I think probably one of the more complex systems. So part of the issue here is how you're playing, right? For instance, easily the most complex system that I've encountered would be Burning Wheel. I don't know if everyone will agree with that, but if you look at Burning Wheel and you integrate it with something like the Roll20 API system, the amount of work you need goes into simply character creation, and a lot of what you would consider heavy math and like matching of skills is all done behind the scenes by a computer, making gameplay a lot faster. So does that mean the system is simple on 20?
I don't know. With Burning Wheel, it's odd because so much of that complexity is front-loaded into specifically character creation, and it doesn't really come up again after that in the same way. But with like other systems, like
I don't know, because I've seen people.
It's
like,
constant.
Is it a will roll? Is it steal? Once you've tied on a specific roll, you go down to stats. From stats, you break it with traits. That part remains intact and can be a little complex and intimidating, confusing. But overall, the dice part of it, which is usually very complex, becomes quite easy to integrate, Roll20 computing AIs and, APIs, sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's perhaps another day. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't want to make the whole discussion slightly more difficult, but it's not just if the system is more or less simple or complex, but also how you're playing it.
Yeah, I feel like...
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like that sort of is a cop-out in some sense, because you can basically say the same thing about literally any rule, because people hack the shit out of Dungeons & Dragons to the point where it's like, you may as well not even be playing Dungeons & Dragons anymore. And yeah, it started out as being the same thing as someone else's game, but when you're ignoring half of the rules entirely just to make things run more smoothly, is it really the same game anymore?
I mean, isn't that the entire point of 5th edition? The 5th edition book contains very few actual rules and a number of optional systems. Same thing for Burning Wheel. I think it's less a cop-out and more a customization of the level of complexity you'd like. Same thing back to Pathfinder. Pathfinder Core Book is not nearly as difficult as if you throw on like Ultimate Adventures and Ultimate Campaigns and really any of the extra class books.
I mean, Pathfinder did start out, though, as a more complex 3.5, and 3.5 was
it started out as a fix for many of the 3.5's rolling float complexities. It was actually quite simple compared to how 3.5 was at the time.
Yeah, but I mean, compared to the original 3.5, it was considerably more bloated.
And 3.5 was a fix for 3.0, so you have the evolution of the rule set. Let me recontextualize the concept and put it in a sort of a spectrum or, a grade, if you will. On one end, you have systems that basically, for the most part, when confronted with a system, the players and the GM say, there is no rule for X. On the other side of the spectrum, we have, there's always a rule. I think that's a good way of approaching this. For example, take Dungeon World or anything powered by the Apocalypse World engine. The tendency is minimal rule set, and for most of the things that would be, outliers, there is no rule. And decisions have to be made based on the fiction, what the fiction demands at the moment, the group, etc. So Arthur's take on, what the group dynamic is, it plays into that. Then on the other side of the system, when we talk about GURPS, for example, we have the idea that there's always a rule. Like there's 5, 10, 15 pages of martial arts, 10, 15, 20, 30 pages about different weapons, and weapons have extended code systems. So armor piercing and rapid fire and burst fire and all that. And with grappling, there's probably 5, 10 different rules as well. And I think somewhere in the middle, as we're talking about Pathfinder and 3.x, etc., D&D, the original system was designed, in fact, to pare down the complexities that arose from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, first and second edition. But because of the phenomenon of Splat, and Splat books, I think, something that we're going to have to talk about in the show because they take a whole new dimension. But as people added more and more to it, and essentially these rules became essential to the game, and so once they were introduced, you couldn't just toss them back out because people made not only the personal investment, but also the financial investment in the rules that they bought and the books they bought. It became increasingly complex because there always was a rule. And not only that, there was a variation of that rule, like 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 variations on the same rule. So let's say that we're playing a game and you're trying to sell someone on a particular rule set. You talk about Burning Wheel, having a front-loaded complex character creation is something that could turn off a lot of people because in order to get to point B from point A, which is from not playing the game to at least having a character, I have to deal with all this. But then it can happen, and later on, once you sort of master some of the mechanics, you're like, well, not that hard. But it can be a big hurdle. Thoughts?
Yeah, I've definitely played with a lot of those players, and usually how I got through it was just sort of like tying character creation into world building enough that people would be distracted and not get bored and give up halfway through. But that's sort of just a danger of the system in general, where if you're playing with people who aren't really interested in engaging with things mechanically, they're only really interested in engaging things narratively, then any system that is mechanics heavy is never really going to work that well.
That sounds like a whole different discussion.
Yeah, that's a whole
about
different
the nature of matching your system to your players and the reverse.
True enough. Well, let's think about, say, if someone says to me, oh, this is a great system because it's a simple system. What are some of the things expectations of what quote unquote is a simple system? And what are the things you're looking for in such a system?
Small number of dice needed, and probably by the same logic, small number of stats. Not a lot to keep track of. As has commonly been said, Pathfinder and 3.5, and to some extent in 5e, your sheet looks like a tax accounting form. That is not a simple system. I think those are all signs of an unsimple system.
Yeah, the more things you have to look up and the more disparate the different systems are from each other, that's usually the best sign of complexity. It's like if everything sort of flows from the same sort of philosophy, where you can sort of like know what the mechanic of one thing is because you know what the mechanic of the first thing is, and that can sort of be applied broadly across the whole thing, that's a good sign of a system that's sort of like been designed to be simple. But when like the rules for making a grappling check are completely different from the rules for making an attack roll, which are completely different from the rules for making saving throws or skill checks, it just very quickly gets difficult.
So essentially the promise of a simple, and I probably have to put quotations every time I say the word simple around the word, is that it's very easy to get into. Right, you get into it. You know, somebody hands you a character sheet and goes like, "Oh yeah, you have this. Just put in a number, do this, roll one die, say by itself, or a die and a simple modifier, and you're good to go." And it should be able to conceptualize what's going on. But especially for experienced players, a complex system, and we talked about splat books before, offers a lot of customization and also a lot of sort of choices, right? You can create a character, supposedly, the way you want it to. And also I think people think of simple systems as being more universal systems, although in reality, usually it tends to be that one level of complexity also comes from trying to emulate everything at once in one rule set. So you agree that maybe it's necessary for giving choices to players automatically makes a system more complex?
Not necessarily. I would look at Fate as a kind of system where a lot of choices are left up to the players through the aspects and various other mechanics. The game is not made any harder by it. It's like keywording for your character.
It's sort of something that Apocalypse World does too, where like they use adjectives and other sort of words that are narrative to also be mechanical descriptors. Or Tech Noir does this also, which I think maybe actually was powered by the Apocalypse Act. But anyways, they get away with a lot of it just because, like, when you say your character is hard, that is both a mechanical and a fictional thing. They sort of, like, tied the two together in a way that's easy enough that you can just sort of, like, jump between the two without it being too hard to pick up. Once you get used to using jargon is also mechanics, though.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that people say, it's very complex is, and Arthur mentioned this earlier, dice mechanics. The idea that the more dice you have to roll, the more complex things become. Great example is anything that uses dice pool, like anything that uses more than 3 dice in a dice pool system, such as Shadowrun and old and even new White Wolf games, right? The fact that you have to pick up like 5 or 6 dice for every action and just throw them, and then you have to sort of pick the die and go, okay, this is a success and this is not, and this cancels this and that. That can also be daunting as well. Because part of the reason I think is the promise of simple systems is that they're faster. You get to do things at a much quicker pace, while a more complex system slows down gameplay. It sort of atomizes gameplay.
I'm not sure I would say more dice in quantity make things complex. I think it's more types of dice that make things complex. Yeah. Using Shadowrun dice as the basis is kind of a weird argument because Shadowrun's complexity isn't in the number of dice you're throwing, except to sort out, is this, and it only exists before 5th edition. Is it an exploding die? Like, do I roll this 6 again for even higher success? I think in 5th edition, they just make it, you need a 5 or a 6 and you succeed. Mm-hmm. The complexity of Shadowrun comes from the giant tables of weapon charts and range mechanics and spells. And it's not so much, for me at least, the number of dice you're throwing.
It's again, figuring out what that number should be, and like what the target number should be instead, rather than the dice themselves.
But when it's like I need a D12, a D6, a D10, and a D8 in order to play this game, that means you're going to be throwing a lot of different dice. I've seen quite a few new players who just are like, I don't know. I know it sounds weird, but they just don't know the differences between the dice. They don't look at them and automatically think that's a D12. I can see 12 faces. They're just so used to seeing D6s.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Savage World works something like that, although the number of dice at any one time is not that.
Yeah, it's usually paired dice, and they throw in cards at the same time,
Which is ironic, again, because Savage World is supposed to be one of those supposedly simple systems that is supposed to be also a universal system as well.
Sure, but in that way, from what I just described about Shadowrun, Savage Worlds has perhaps the opposite problem. They have a lot of different dice mechanics, but their rules are much simpler than Shadowrun's. You aren't going to be looking up a weapons chart for, if you're 3-round bursting at 800 yards at a target in the darkness with 3/4 cover, you're just going to be aiming for a number.
Mm-hmm. Say, like, usually target number is 4. Like, if you get 4 better than, But even then, I mean, one could argue the dice themselves are just, random generators, number generators. But what you attach to the dice, such as target number, whether you have a sort of a system like most games like D&D, which is a total success or failure system versus a partial success and a partial failure system. I think Hellas, World of Stone and Fire was a system that had D20, simple die, but it had a range of successes from total failure to partial failure, success, and so on and so forth, right? And for beginning players, like, well, much easier to just hit a number and that's it. But again, making it a little more complex. By the way, for people who don't know the system, Hellas, Worlds of Stone and Fire, I believe is the complete name. It's a Greco-Roman or Greek-inspired space opera game. It's a great game, but it does have that mechanic. Again, having that added mechanic sort of perhaps may seem to solve the situation. So what happens when I miss the point by 1 or 2 as opposed to by 5 or 10 or 15, something like that. But it's yet another factor that the players and the game master has to take into account every time you roll the die, every time you try to resolve something. Could it also be that perhaps it's a way we think, Arthur brought this in the beginning, how we think about things, that, for example, we may rely entirely too much on, say, GM fiat, or relying too much on dice mechanics when a particular situation might call for simply a straight decision, based on the fiction.
Well, that's entirely the realm of house rules, a decision between players and a game master or game masters to just say, this is how we are going to do this within this system. This is an alteration we are going to make.
And that's where, like, a lot of D&D actually came from, was just house rules that became so popular. Now they're part of the game, effectively.
So the longer the system is around, again, the more it tends to attract these varying rules that stack up to the basics, and maybe to the point that they might even break the system, and then you have to have a new edition, et cetera, et cetera. Like, one could argue that's a bit the lifespan of Dungeons and Dragons, that the new edition tries to fix what the other edition did until the point where, you have to either take it or leave it, and then they make a complete new edition that it's barely similar to what happened before. I mean, you go from 3.8.
Maybe that's a very Dungeons and Dragons focused problem. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it happens in very many other systems.
Yeah, no one really has that same sort of legacy that Dungeons and Dragons does.
For instance, Pendragon is essentially mostly unchanged from how it started. They do release new editions every few years, but I've been told that you could play first or second edition Pendragon with the newest material and it would not be that different from how it began as. It's mostly just a reprinting of the books.
Well, I'm going beyond just Dungeons and Dragons, because obviously it's a game that still dominates the imagination of role-playing, even if it doesn't dominate necessarily what everybody is playing. Let's make that absolutely clear. I was doing the research on doing a cyberpunk game, and I say, I remember Cyberpunk 2020, which is a great game.
Oh,
right?
God.
Yeah. Was
it a great game, though? I'm currently in a Cyberpunk 2020 campaign, so let me ask you, was it a great game? Was it really?
Well, that's the thing. When I went back to look at the rules, it's like, the fiction around it, not as extensive as the fiction in Shadowrun, but the fiction around it was pretty cool. But once you started getting into the rule set, again, it went well beyond the dice. The stuff that was like, 1d10 plus this plus that, that's very simple, right? What happened with the interlock system, which was a system that powered both not only Cyberpunk 2020, but also Mechton, it got changed into the fusion system, which was, again, a promise that it was going to be much simpler. And in fact, it had two dice mechanic, one for D6s that came from a superhero game, and the 1d10 that came from, the interlock system. And while the promise is that the curves were very similar, the target numbers were very similar, once I started, again, reading about the fusion system, it was like, maybe this wasn't as simple as it promised to be. So sometimes we don't get the expectations we expect, maybe because of what we think it was back in the day, or simply because once you get into the nitty-gritty of any given system, the problems sort of pile up. And what seems simple, again, becomes complex.
Yeah, and they may have also been trying to go for a different kind of simplicity where, I caught myself doing this with my own things sometimes where I started thinking too much about, what are the mathematical probability breakdowns of all these things? And how can I, make them smoother or nicer or just, better for what I wanted, when really all that was doing was making more complexity, but mathematically everything was then simpler and easier at the same time. So with 2d6, it can be a little awkward to plot out what the probabilities of something are, or anytime multiple dice are involved. But if you're using just a flat d20, then every increment is only a 5%. So you can sort of eyeball what your percentage chances are much easier with a single dice. And so that might have been sort of what they were going for instead, but in exchange created a whole different kind of complexity.
I think also when you look at these situations, many of these games, there's again an assumption that simple is also generic, that a lot of the simple systems leave to the players the sort of the world building. They don't come with ready-made campaigns and that sort of thing. They don't front load the system with a lot of expectations of what they're trying to, and again, I think that's something we might talk about in another episode. They're trying to emulate, right? Dungeons and Dragons. Go ahead.
Some systems that could be considered simple, they come with their own. They're built only to be used in a certain setting, right? Apocalypse World is meant to be used in an apocalypse setting. You don't play Apocalypse World in a fantasy medieval setting. You play Dungeon World in such a setting. In that way, the system is simpler, right? When you're playing Apocalypse World, you're not tracking magic. You're tracking the psychic maelstrom and guns, and that's about it, right? To that extent for equipment-based and fictional-based. There are simpler systems where I would, again, jump back to Fate, where you just kind of outline things based on the aspects of your character, and you can throw it into whatever setting matches where you're going. But just because a game is built to be played in a certain setting doesn't make it more or less complex.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about... go ahead.
What I sort of noticed, with what people are wanting from games with a lot more rules complexity versus people who are wanting games with a lot more rules simplicity, is sort of there's two sort of philosophies over a lot of rules, and really only the one over very few rules. With a lot of rules, they sort of fall into two camps of, one are just newer GMs and such who are not confident about their skills, and it's very, very helpful in those situations to always be able to be well, I can look up this rule if I'm unsure, and I know there's going to be something that'll help me get through situations where I'm struggling. And the other side is sort of this historical camp that D&D arose from, which is the miniature wargaming and such. It's from all the fun that's had about really getting into these systems and gaming them and creating like optimized characters and trying to deal with encounters in optimized ways. It's very much like, oh, this is fun to plan out encounters and do them in this detailed, complex way. While with the very simple systems, it's almost always a situation of, I don't want my complexity to be in the mechanics. I want my complexity to be entirely in the narrative. And so they just sort of shift all of that into, let's spend way more effort fleshing out a very complex story and world rather than just fleshing out complex rules and dealing with those. Which isn't to say that they don't get used in both ways.
Mm-hmm. I think going to Pathfinder, going again back to D&D, and by the way, let's make a note, of course, most games out there do not have an alignment system. But even a rule that was designed like an alignment system to clarify to the players, an aspect of the individual characters as well as nations and groups, etc., ended up being a straitjacket the moment you added a spell like, detect alignment or no alignment. Because now that became it tended to have a fixed feature on characters, locations, etc. And that had an effect that a world in D&D or any world that uses that combination of that spell, those abilities, and the alignment system had to have a particular flavor to it. And I think that's one of the reasons why in 4th edition they tried to pare it down, and they eliminated that in 5th edition, and why many other systems simply do not have an alignment system. On one hand, it makes it easier for GMs and even players to say, yeah, my character is such and such. But on the other hand, it can serve as a straitjacket to the fiction.
Well, I don't mean to be oppositional here, but
go ahead. That's what you're here for.
The alignment system can also tell really good stories. I recently started up a stream campaign where the premise that the players wanted to see wasn't a world where good and evil was the main conflict, as we so often have, but law and chaos were the main battles. Like, is it more important to do what the law says or what is right? And it's turned into a very interesting campaign, perhaps quite different. Alignment for the players, I think on my own part, hasn't mattered as much, but alignment for the NPCs has mattered quite a bit. And I use that to kind of power how I'm going to play various aspects of the game. If someone comes from a very lawful nation, they're probably slightly more rigid in thinking, perhaps. They definitely follow laws on paper rather than follow perhaps their heart. So, in a way, alignment is another one of those optional systems you can pay attention to if you care about, and forget about it if you don't, which often it is forgotten about.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me to the idea that I think people use terms like fluff, and I like to think of rules as essentially hard rules and then soft rules, where the hard rules often, but not always, are the dice mechanics and the sort of troubleshooting or mechanics. You encounter a specific situation, roll some dice, decide the situation, etc. Outside of game, GM fiat or the fiction. And then everything else after that is soft rules. And the reason why I say soft rules, because, and it's in my experience, is that they're a rule until the GM or the group decides that they're not applicable. I think I make this, Scardian probably has heard this before, the example of the Candyland example, which is, let's say you have an established campaign, and in one corner of the map there is, at least the campaign says, there's this island that is called Candyland and ruled by the Lollipop King, etc. That often is described as fluff because, you can take it or leave it. But the way I see it is essentially it's a soft rule until such time as the GM or anybody says, you know what, that doesn't fit with what we're doing. We're not going to go there. Screw that. Erase that. We're not going to deal with it. And I think that's sort of part of the problem of simple and complex and being a spectrum is that you have rules creep, which we hadn't really talked about. We sort of dance around the concept. That is the idea that as you have more expansions or you have more house rules, etc., it sort of builds upon it. Not all rule systems like a Pendragon suffer from it as much as or at all. But I think that many systems over years and even decades have had this system where because of the way games are marketed, etc., you do have a set rules creep. Shadowrun, for example, had a lot of splat books, had a lot of expansions. The entirety of White Wolf, the old world, and even the new world was built around, all these clan books and all these world books. We don't see that as much today with 5th edition, but Pathfinder, it's a mix of adventures, but also other people publishing for Pathfinder, etc. And that sets a situation that once you introduce the possibility of a new rule to the table, taking it out becomes very difficult.
It depends where the game ends up going. I've had games
that depends on your players, right? Like, if you say we're going to be adding this new rule where if you roll a 1, you drop your weapon, and then 4 sessions in, everyone's like, "Man, we are dropping our weapons all the time. I hate this. Let's take it out." That's a group decision as to whether everyone is like, "Okay, let's take it out," or whether the GM's like, "No, I want this rule to stay in because we all agreed."
Yeah, and I've also had situations where it's like, well, we keep running into different problems, so we just keep adding more and more house rules to fix these different problems until we hit a point where we're just like, we don't really care about 90% of any of this anymore. Let's instead just cut out as much as we can and start going in the other direction, seeing like, well, do we even need to have most of these things? And that's where like half of my groups have ended up going, I feel like, over time.
So complexity is also a matter of learning the rules and becoming familiar with them to the point where you go like, you know what, we don't need this, or we do need that. We're talking about the last show, which is everybody sort of becomes a hacker of games as they go along, right? And eventually you can hack a game to the point where it's completely broken. And then you have to decide whether we roll back the hacks or we play something else.
Well, isn't what we're talking about here, like introducing optional rules, reducing certain rules, kind of how many role-playing systems are being developed lately?
I mean, I feel like that's how it's always been. It's just, now it's almost in a way more explicitly talked about in that fashion. Like, if we're going back to the D&D example, like, all this talk about like house rules and balancing out house rules and things is really where like D&D grew from. It started with this basic set, and then it was just tons of people making house rules and sharing house rules with each other. And then eventually the house rules get codified into more concrete rules, and that just sort of built up. But the difference now is just sort of like people are sort of admitting and talking about hacking and like making house rules as though, and rightfully so, that it is game design, which I don't think was really done much in the past.
So essentially what the new wave of games are saying, we are handing over more authorial control to the groups from the get-go, right? Although there was always the idea, because before it was sort of more of a talk between the game designer and the GM. Like, oh yeah, you are the one the GM was sort of the intermediary between the game designer and the group, because it was very much, and still is a lot of people, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad way of playing a game, very much a GM-centric, I carry most of the weight of the world on my shoulders kind of situation. But now with this new approach, or not newer, I suppose, there's an open conversation between designer and gaming group. Is that an accurate description of what's going on?
Well, the GM being God was a very Gygaxian thing and has been proliferated through D&D's kind of status as the one true king of the industry. I don't know that it was as present in other RPG systems that
it's
like, the GM is right kind of thing.
A lot of early systems, like, yeah, they did do that. I think it's something that's increasingly disappeared, though, or like people have been paring it back a lot, at least. And I think that's where a lot of that actually comes from then, instead, is more just like the role of the GM being pared back and like narrative responsibility and like creative responsibility being shifted to the players a lot more.
And unsurprisingly, since we're kind of on the topic of game design becoming more open to some extent, in the beginning, It was you came up with a rule system, you printed it out, you sold it at conventions, people talked about it in magazines, you'd call your friends about it, but there was no internet. And I think with the advent of the internet, where you can just go on Twitter and say, this rule is super dumb, and people can be like, okay, we'll fix it in the next edition, no problem. There's a lot more communication. I think you can see it to some extent with the hack attacks by Adam Koebel and Stephen Lumpkin. You can see it in the way Stephen is customizing the roleplay West Marches game. You can see it in Critical Role, how they've altered their campaign over from where they began at to when they put it on the stream to like 10 episodes in. They started changing things based on like audience reactions and audience suggestions as to how they were doing things. The level of feedback that game designers are getting is much greater and much faster and more real time in the last 2 decades than it has been in the past. And that is changing the way that game systems are being made.
Let's talk about this podcast. This podcast is, as I said before, it's the Mathsquad Community Podcast. It's about a community of people around Adam Koebel, who's one of the designers of Dungeon World. Not the only one, by the way. And in his Twitch streams, in his YouTube channel comments, you can reach him on Twitter. Or always, by the way, if you're reaching to anyone, anywhere in the internet, please be polite and concise. Those are very good rules. And even discussion, we are members of this community. It's part of that much larger community discussion that can reach out to designers and back again, right? And also, I think with Kickstarter and other crowdfunding systems, we're now seeing the evolution of design before our own very eyes. Before it was somebody just, again, wrote the rules, delivered it to the world, and, well, it was up to the players to do with it as they please.
I think probably there's no system that amplifies this process more than Blades in the Dark, which Adam has very publicly been supportive of. He's writing for it, and he's hosting John Harper sessions. And based on the way people have reacted to those sessions, based on the way people are playing with kind of, I'm going to call it open beta rules, although technically it's really only open to people who bought the Kickstarter, he's changed the way the rules have worked to be easier for them in their sessions with Adam and Sean and Strauss.
Yeah, this is something also that he and Vincent Baker are doing, in that they're getting actively involved with everyone who are hacking their games. And so every time people are coming up with new hacks and new twists on how to run the games and things, they're actively involved in those processes too, and talking with these people and being like, hey, this is an interesting thing you did. Why did you do this? Why is this better than what I already had in Blades? And what can I do to make your jobs easier as hackers? What are we lacking that you need? Or what did you find particularly helpful that we did? And that's something that wasn't really a process that people could do that easily before now.
To draw it back towards the discussion of simple versus complex systems, the first set of rules released for Blades in the Dark was not very well explained compared to how it looks now. Now, part of that is the beta, but part of it was also the mechanics of it were kind of rough. There was a lot of fictional positioning based on both effect and your ability to affect change, and then how dangerous something could be for you. And as his design process went on, I think it's become much more clear. And while the system may be slightly more complex than how it began, it's much better explained, and so perhaps has ended up simpler, at least in my eyes.
And that, I think, is a question also of clarity, right? Because a rule could be simple, but if due to lack of editing or phrasing, etc., in some cases, we also talk about systems that are not even American systems. We talk mostly about American systems, but we also talk about systems in Japan and Europe and other places, which can also lead to certain obscurity, right? Understanding the nature of the rule or the rule set and where it comes from can bring a level of clarity that is distinct from simply something being simple or complex. I mean, you're describing with Blades in the Dark. When I read the first document, I was like, I don't really know what they're trying to do here. I've given it a second look, and I'm a bit, I'm a bit confused with what's going on, at least on the earlier versions. But probably it's more that, for example, you introduce new terminology, and the way the document was edited could be also a problem as well.
Yeah, and there's something also where, like, a lot of Japanese RPGs have part of this going on, but also some things like Monster Hearts or Pendragon, where there are a lot of cultural references where if you didn't grow up in that culture, it's not explained at all or detailed in the games themselves. But it's very much key to understanding and playing these games. Like with Monster Hearts, if you didn't grow up or in like American culture, especially through like high school and things, most of that game seems sort of weird and doesn't make all that much clear sense. And like similarly with a lot of things like Ryutama or Maid RPG.
Say, Ryutama and Maid RPG are the two that I would immediately call to mind that are the Japanese version of that for us.
If you're not intimately familiar with like Japanese culture and anime, then like you're missing like 90% of what those games actually are.
Pure? I don't know what that means, man. Explain it to me like I'm 5.
Yeah, but it's interesting because especially in Japanese RPGs, and we can also throw in video games as well, which have influenced back and forth. So, American tabletop RPGs influence computer game RPGs. Both of them went to Japan, but because the Japanese had their own, they didn't have this strong cultural connection to the fantasy scene through the eyes of both Americans and Western Europeans, they abstracted it even more. Tabletop RPG was an abstraction of war games, which was a simulation of actual war. So we have multiple levels of abstraction. And then when finally, decades later, those games come back to America, people are like, but why is it that this guy has this sword that looks so weird and this armor with the huge shoulder blades, but nothing below that? It's, that's, I think, one of the things that can make things more, not necessarily complex, I say more obscure. But then again, as more people have more contact with the culture of anime and stuff like that, either directly or derivatively, say World of Warcraft, for example, a lot of the graphics in World of Warcraft and the style is very much anime influence. They become accustomed to the tropes and they say, oh, maybe I could try this and play it out. It becomes a little more clear.
Yeah, I think that's something that's definitely people are getting better at, is sort of like finding ways to integrate like a lot of that cultural stuff directly in ways that wasn't really done before, where it's sort of like explained better throughout the setting and the rules. This is something that like weirdly Burning Wheel does well, but not, I don't think, intentionally, where like the setting is so tied intimately into their rules and rule sets that like it's very hard to get it wrong, just because like all of these intimate details about like what is basically medieval European society is directly intimately tied into the actual mechanical aspects of the game, which isn't really true of a lot of other games in the same way. They just sort of make assumptions about that cultural sort of idea, but it's something I've definitely been noticing happening more.
Go ahead, Arthur.
I mean, I feel like in order to add to this, I would have to go back through the whole evolution of Record of Lodoss War that we talked about before the show. I don't want to rehash that because anyone who knows what I'm talking about will just nod their head, and anyone who doesn't will be confused as to what the heck Record of Lodoss War is.
Excellent anime. You should check it out.
You really should check it out. It's quite good. Super old, though.
To give me an example of a simple rule system that the first time I engaged with it gave me a bit of a headache. And just, again, because of the assumptions that I was bringing to the table as someone who played, again, a lot of D&D, but many other systems. In Dungeon World, the idea that the game master doesn't throw any dice, I was like, okay, when do I do an action? Where do I I mean, you have moves, but you don't use dice. As a game master, was like, there's something missing here, and why is the magical items don't have any pluses? And then, what the? And it wasn't necessarily the system was broken in any way. It was that it was a different system that made different assumptions. And to me, because of the assumptions that I was bringing to the table, the tropes, etc., and my experience, it was a bit obscure.
I've had the same issue when I first looked at Dungeon World. I was very confused and had to watch Stephen Lumpkin's roleplay R&D Dungeon World to figure out just what was going on here.
Yep, I did the same thing with Dungeon World, but my reason for messing it up was different in that, like, I came into it expecting what I sort of had gotten from other sort of fantasy games, which is more of like a heroic hero's journey sort of fantasy. Well, it was coming very much from like more of a traditional Moldvay style D&D, where it was all about like these dungeon crawling adventures against like high stakes and like highly deadly situations, and like the stories that came out of those. So I was trying to run it in a way it really wasn't designed for, but I never really got that thing from the book itself, that it was trying to go for this like more traditional style. And I didn't really have a background with like this more traditional style of Dungeons and Dragons. So I was just running it completely wrong. But once I finally learned that, then I was like, oh, this system makes so much sense now and it works so well. I see what was going on here.
Yeah, I think to some extent your preconceptions of a system do help determine its simplicity or its complexity. When I first tried to run Blades in the Dark, it was a horrible, awful mess. And unfortunately, there are records of it since I ran it on stream. Records I've shamefully attempted to hide to the best of my ability. But having seen other people run it, Eric Bulgaris, Adam Koebel, John Harper, I get it now. But if I hadn't walked into the system with the baggage of thinking in a different way, it might have been easier for me.
So regardless of perhaps the actual complexity of the game rules and what we may end up defining as such, and we didn't really come up with a good definition. We touched on a lot of cornerstones because nailing the stuff down, it's pretty hard. I think a good system should be at the very least clear, if not necessarily concise. I think we can agree on that, right?
I think that complexity versus simplicity is partially in the eye of the beholder to some extent, but it's also something it's like an instinctual thing. You recognize it when you're looking at it. I might not know art, but this is art kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at 20 splat books of D&D, I know that this is probably pretty complex with a giant pile of dice sitting next to it. And when I look at, a playbook for Apocalypse World with 2 D6s sitting next to it, I'm pretty sure this is a little bit easier than that. You might not be able to quantify it or qualify it, but when you look at it, you'll know. Terrible answer, I know. Terrible answer.
No. Yeah, that's sort of how you're going to have to go about figuring it out for most parts. And like the one thing I always sort of look for is how much jargon do they use when explaining things, and how many extra words are they using in like all of their explanations and things that don't necessarily need to be there. Because that's always going to be like a sure sign of, okay, something is going on here where there's a lot more detail going into this than I would otherwise expect or really be looking for in a system. And that's sort of like the first red flag that always sort of tips me off. But beyond that, it's just sort of a case of, well, I have to actually be playing it to figure it out.
Yeah, I think, and I think that sort of has become the unwritten, but very much Adam's golden rule. That is, ask yourself this one question: does the system does what you need it to do? If it does, play it. If it doesn't, play something else.
That was a really good outro line, by the way. I don't know if we're nearing the end of time, but
yes,
that sounds like something that someone would say at the end of like a radio broadcast. I'm thinking NPR here.
Yeah, I might have to edit it so that it goes that way. But this is a conversation,
Yeah.
so yeah, we are going to have an outro, and the outro goes something like this. First of all, Arthur, Scary DM, could you tell us where we can find you on the interwebs?
I'll go first. You can find me in pretty much everything I do at Scaridium on Twitter. I mostly rant about science stuff there, but I'm also going to be starting making a lot more content as my RPG is getting closer to the playtesting phase, and also I'm going to be starting streaming more as I have more free time. So you can find everything there pretty much.
And I'm Arthur Perkins, also known as AP Gaming Real. You can find me on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, all at AP Gaming Real. I am a tabletop Twitch streamer. I do at least 4 shows a week. I've had 24 different systems be featured on my channel, and you can watch myself, John Harper, Adam Koebel, Stephen Lumpkin, and Eric Bulgaris in the first tabletop broadcast of The Sprawl, where I had a lot of fun hanging out with all those cool people and jumping off buildings.
That was a very entertaining one-shot.
That was pretty good. And also very dynamic as well, because it was an entire table full of GMs just spitballing ideas on the go. So it was very interesting. And you can find Adam Koebel, who is I like to call him the patron saint of the podcast. You can find him on Twitch and YouTube, as well as Twitter. They're Scary Skinny Ghost on Twitter, and on YouTube, you can find him under Adam Koebel. And you can find this program, as anything that we do here on the Lessons Learned channel on YouTube. I'm also going to expand on Twitch, especially on the game design aspects of the game, so that I'm working on. So I'll always invite any member of the Mathsquad community to join us at around 2 o'clock p.m. for recording, and of course the broadcast will be posted during the week. And as always, if you like this or any show on my channel, please comment and subscribe, and we will see you when we see you. Good night.